Hello, welcome. We're going to be having a surviving work conversation about leadership and management in health and social care. And to talk to us today, we have Angela Eden and Antonia Maclean. And I'm going to ask just a first question to introduce you and your work, which is to ask you just to tell us something briefly about your experience of work and what brought you to this profession.
Well, I'm an organisation development consultant. I've always been interested in work. I did 18 years with a big corporation, and then for the last 13 years I've worked with all sorts of organisations to look at how they could be better at doing whatever they're trying to do. I like it because it's about people contributing, and it's about people finding ways of contributing better together. So yeah. Deep area of fascination for me.
How did I get here? I think I'm going to start there because I've had a very long and windy career through the theatre, education, working in local authorities, working with young people, working in the big commercial world, and now as a freelance consultant, again in organisation development. There's a theme that runs through it all, which is hoping that people's working lives can be better. I recognised a long time ago that the amount of time you spend at work and the amount of complexity that you experience and how damaging and rewarding it can be at the same time is incredibly important to people. So that's why I do it. And what I really like about it is this opportunity to improve people's working lives.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that we're going to be picking up on in our discussion today is about the links and the similarities and differences between working with organisations in the private sector and in the public sector, and the sort of bits in between, the third sector as well. So my first question, just to kick off the discussion, is what do you think are the principal differences between managing a public sector organisation and a private sector organisation?
And we've had a bit of a conversation about this before, Antonia. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that direction that people said about public sector workers being more like the commercial world. And that's a conversation we've had. And the other thing we were talking about was whether it was important whether you were in a small organisation or whether you were in a very large organisation.
Regardless of whether it was private or public.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or voluntary for that matter. Yeah, I think time is important here, because actually I think the differences or the pressures on private and public sector organisations are probably more similar than ever before, simply because of the massive problems of funding that now exist. So, and there's been the adoption of a whole host of, classical private sector commercial management techniques within public sector organisations. But I think there are still going to be some fundamental differences, because these organisations have got very different origins. So I think we talked about public sector, people that choose to join a public sector organisation have perhaps got a vocation. They've certainly got a sense of, interest in doing something for public good, or being part of an organisation that's doing something for public good.
Oh, and there was a stability thing. I remember in my first public sector job, one of my aunts who believed in stability said, "Oh, great, you've got a job for life." And that is so different now. There was a sense of, which wasn't the same in a private sector company. There was this sense of you could be dismissed, whereas public sector was stability and pensions and reliability. And of course, all of that's changed too now.
And it's changed within the private sector as well.
Absolutely.
So, I certainly joined a company where, you were regarded as being a new starter, even if you'd done 18 years, as most people have done 30. That doesn't exist anymore. So I think the other thing that I was wondering about, and we talked about earlier, was about the sense of money and the way money flows through the organisation, and the accountability for money, and whether there are some distinctive differences about that between the two sectors.
And that led me on to thinking that I have an image, and of course we can't generalise, of private sector managers and leaders having a much clearer idea about their role and their authority and their reporting lines. And those gave people much clearer sense of what they were expected to do. And this is a generalisation. It felt, okay, if you're a modern matron on a ward, you have a clear role in relation to, say, the consultant team.
Yeah.
If you're a nurse, you have a clear idea about role. So there are certain bits of the public sector that are very clear about who they report to, and there are others that are not. You're a member of a team. That whole business about the amalgamation of social care teams and social work authority and care workers authority being very mixed and unaligned and unclear. So that was another one about lines of reporting.
Yeah. In fact, that's fascinating because I think of the number of times when I've met people working in health and social care, for example, and I've asked a question about who's your manager, or, you know, do you talk to your manager regularly? And quite often the answer is not clear and a bit flaky, and it's quite shocking, really, because I sort of think, is that and no, there's not always a sense that that's odd that they don't know who their manager is, and, you know, what do they have a regular conversation with their manager. It's almost that's sometimes is not the important thing in the way that they do their job.
So do you have a sense, I mean, I think I'm probably getting a sense of this public sector ethos, I'm coming here to do public good, is linked with a democratic sense of self or a more egalitarian way of thinking about the work. Now, I don't know if this is just a new idea, and I don't know if that's linked up with any theory or any fact, but you can't be so much of a boss, you know, even the word, in a public sector organisation. Now, does this ring any bells with anybody?
Well, one of the sort of criticisms about what's happening in management in health and social care is about money. So the fact that there is less of it, the sort of 10 to 20% cuts, are targets that have been set nationally through the austerity programme. And one of the arguments, one of the research links, is about the transformation of management away from what we can call democratic leadership or flat leadership, where it's much more team-based, 1980s models of nursing care, where sort of, you know, Kaizen, where quality control, where authority is held within the clinical teams, hopefully interdisciplinary teams. And what's happened, one of the arguments is that because we've got this preoccupation with cuts, that's the political agenda, what we're seeing is an increase in command and control management. So managers, this isn't a criticism of the individuals in this system, this is a change in the system. Command and control, do this now. Negotiating about the clinical outcomes and the financial outcomes. And there's a lot of lack of clarity, I think, about who is responsible for what. Partly because those decisions aren't being made at a team level anymore. There's a lot more pressure from a political level, from a national level, from a trust level to reach targets which haven't been negotiated at a workplace level.
But that's the same in the commercial world. There's absolutely no difference in terms of who's setting the targets in the commercial world. You know, we will raise our profit margin by 2% this year, is set by the board. It's, you know, it's not democratically agreed on. And right the way through the company, people readjust to that target, you know, along a long line of command.
The difference is, though, is I think might be that in the commercial organisation, the goal might be extra profit or reduction cost or whatever the goal is, but the route to do that will always need to stay at being, you know, we're trying to deliver a product or a service to the customers, and the customers are continuing to choose to buy that product or service. Okay. One of the things that I think is problematic, and you mentioned this earlier, is that the splitting between the cost saving activity and the service delivery activity, and that there's not necessarily in some of these organisations the quality of conversation that needs to go on, which is how do we deliver the service that we need to deliver at a reduced cost, but actually we're pooling the expertise, the clinical, the professional expertise that we've got to deliver that service.
That's really interesting. I had to choose which hospital to have some treatment in, and in order to make that choice I was shown some statistics about time and waiting list and how many whatever. I chose the hospital that had a shorter waiting list.
Right.
Why did it have a shorter waiting list? Because its quality of care on another index was less.
Yeah.
So I was I chose one
Yeah.
because I could get seen quicker, but not necessarily better.
Yeah. Right.
Now, if that's what the metrics are in terms of improving customer choice in a hospital treatment programme, that's very interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I didn't like to have to make that choice. I would have rather that somebody had pooled all that expertise, as you said, and all of the hospitals were of a high enough standard and shared the waiting list.
Yeah.
But they're not. They're in competition with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is that about? That's the commercial
Or
world.
they're in competition with other bits of the supply chain downstream, the local authority. They're struggling with the the delivery.
So there's
across.
the commercial model about product and delivery being transferred onto health sector, where one would say it was inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I don't know who's responsible for that. I guess the Department of Health.
I think it's very complicated in health and social care, isn't it, to make this sort of clear distinction between private and public, because a lot of us work for sort of private organisations, contractors or social enterprises or charities, third sector organisations, and the distinction between a way of working as a public sector way of working and a private sector way of working no longer exists.
Yeah, I think that's...
What there tends to be is a sort of uncomfortable, in health and social care, an uncomfortable relationship between clinical outcomes and financial outcomes. I just want to take you back to something you said earlier about managers' relationships to money in the private sector. What did you mean by that? Give us a characterisation of that.
I think the conversation about money is, again, notwithstanding generalisations, it's a more obvious and okay conversation to be having in private sector organisations, because they're there to win sales, keep control of their costs, and to make a profit or surplus. That's why I say there's a closing the gap with voluntary organisations.
Yeah.
And I think it's more easy to talk about it. Most organisations would have results that they would report publicly. If they don't report them publicly, there'll be some level of communication internally. People would expect to have some of the goals will be sales, profit, cost related.
So I want to go down two paths here, and I don't know which one to choose. But one was your story about the 10%.
Yeah.
And the other is people knowing what the psychological contract is when they join.
Right.
So when you join a commercial company, I think you know what the deal is. You know you're in that deal to turn a profit for the organisation, for its sustainability, in order for you to have a job.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you join because you want the product to be better.
Well, you might.
But you understand
Yeah.
the whole thing about the finance stream. If you're joining a public sector company, a public sector organisation, are people still joining because it's public sector? As my aunt would say, it's a job for life. Is that ethos still in the culture of the organisation? So,
my guess with some of that is, in either case, people are operating at a much sort of lower level. I'm just thinking about companies I've worked with. I want to be a pest control technician. I'm interested in, I like that kind of work. And that work happens to be, it could be with a local authority actually, And it could be with a private sector organisation. You know, those pest control technicians work in both sectors.
So interesting. I was about to say, until you mentioned pest control, I want to be a mental health worker.
Yes,
Right.
Exactly.
And I'm making the link between pest control and mental health worker, which is
Right.
makes me feel quite anxious about making that link. But I want people who are interested in mental health work.
Yeah.
There are some private clinics, but on the whole, they would go into local authorities and get trained and relate to and work through that system, wouldn't they?
Or voluntary sector. And I'm thinking
Yes,
about,
or
they
voluntary
could be in the
sector.
voluntary sector.
Yeah.
So this is important because we're now. So if I have in my mind somebody who works for Mind, which is a commercial organisation as much as anywhere else. It's an organisation, but it's also
It's a third sector rather than
it's
commercial.
third sector, but
Yeah.
it's also a commercial organisation
Well,
that
yes,
has to have attention to finance.
yes.
So I suppose it's
Well, it sells services, doesn't
Yes.
it?
exactly, and it tenders and it
Yeah.
does all of that work. So, and it's a good example because a lot of people that are working with Mind would identify first with being a mental health worker. You know, you're a therapist above everything else. So we've got two streams, two lines of thought, haven't we? One of them is about money,
Yeah.
making viable services. We can have a debate about sustainability of mental health in this country. Tagline, it isn't at the moment. But there's also a question about values and about ethics and what you're signing up to. Now, one of the sort of crude sort of distinctions is that apparently in private sector nobody's got any ethics or values, which actually isn't true, is it? So I'm wondering about how you think about social responsibility, corporate social responsibility.
I mean, I think that's really good the way you've worded that question, because I think that it's, you know, there are millions of people working in the private sector, and you know, many of those people care about, you know, what they do every day, and they want to care about what they do every day. And I think they, you know, most of those people, I think I can say most of those people want to believe that they're operating in an ethical and a good way, you know, absolutely. I think then where there becomes a dissonance for those people is if their company doesn't want to organise, it doesn't want to operate that way too, you know. And I can think of some companies that do operate that way and genuinely feel that, you know, actually, you know, the being able to having a corporate social responsible policy is both important to do, to be seen to be doing it, but actually they use it as a way of genuinely contributing to society. And I think there are some companies that do that, and I think there are other companies that are cynical about it. And the important thing is what is absolutely going to be the case is the people who work for that company will know the difference between the two.
Yeah.
They absolutely, people that work in organisations, they're not stupid. They know whether their company is doing it, you know, just to tick the box, or doing it because they genuinely are interested in it.
And the word gets out.
Yeah.
I work for so-and-so, they've got a really good maternity leave scheme, you ought to try and get a job there. You know, I mean,
absolutely.
it gets out.
Yeah.
I just want to point out, we are talking very much about a Western culture, aren't we? We're not talking about sweatshops in India and buildings burning down.
No.
We're not talking about, we mentioned earlier, the Chinese phone makers who are really, really committing suicide and really ill. We're not talking about those, are we? We're very much, it's our experiences based in the UK.
Yeah, although, I mean, that I do see these, you know, because again, we did talk about, you know, how work was organised 100 years ago and 50 years ago here, where, you know, health and safety and responsibility to employees, you know, there's been a whole legal framework that's built up, as well as a duty of care, a behavioural framework built up over the years. What concerns me, so we could talk about the, you know, some of the poor working practices, poor ways of treating a workforce in other parts of the world, but actually when I'm listening to some of the things that you're saying about workforces in mental and social care, I'm very concerned, because I think we are talking about environments which make people ill. And I think that's, you know, it's a different kind of illness to the ones that perhaps is affecting somebody in a telephone business in China, but actually it's still making people ill, and I see that as being problematic, whether or not the organisation is a public sector organisation or a private sector organisation.
So let's just introduce this idea of precarious work, particularly in health and social care. So one of the real concerns, even though work has always been precarious for somebody somewhere, in the Industrial Revolution, for example, and with mechanisations, but in health and social care we're seeing some very disturbing and high profile cases, changes in the way that we work. One of them, for example, in mental health are call centres, where a lot of self-guided help is provided, and private contractors or employment agencies will employ psychological well-being practitioners, for example, to respond to clients over the phone. And they have a very limited, a very procedural, a very mechanised version of therapeutic care. Some people would argue that doesn't even count as therapy.
Are you talking about commercial sector call centres, or are you talking about things like NHS Connect?
I'm talking, without naming names, I'm talking about...
Which doesn't exist now.
Okay. I'm talking about NHS services which are provided by private contractors that are in...
Okay,
for example,
in call centres. Okay.
Mental health waiting lists for CBT in the NHS. A fair percentage of those will be provided by private contractors. The people working in them are the same people within our profession, it's just their contract of employment is with a private contractor. The other very sort of stark example that's come up recently, which has caused a lot of fuss certainly in mental health, has been about the proposal to create IAPT centres, increased access for psychological therapies, in 350 job centres in the UK. There was a big demonstration about it a few weeks ago. Now, what's interesting is that there's an increased awareness and perception that the nature of the job, what's being promised, how it's being delivered, is detrimental both to the clinician, the person working in those services, and to the patient. So I think we can, even though we can't talk about sort of big historical trends, what we're saying is we have a problem in health and social care about the quality and the way that health and social care is delivered in some settings, and they're receiving more and more public attention.
And not necessarily just commercially contracted out. I mean, they're happening in general. You know, yes. I would like to provide a year-long therapy for this child, and I can't because I've only got 6 sessions.
That's right.
And that's in the public sector domain.
So I suppose one of the questions is, given that a lot of people working in health and social care can be defined as precarious workers, how can managers manage this?
I think the first thing I think about is the challenge around precarious work relates to the quality of work that then gets done by the whole team to deliver whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. And I think that in a care setting, it would seem that actually people being able to work together very comfortably in service of caring for vulnerable people, actually that's critical. So constantly different people and different, no existing relationship and don't know the backstory and all the rest of it actually means that, the care is poorer. And so as a manager, I'm thinking that's not okay from a management point of view, because the manager ultimately is responsible for ensuring that the promise of care has been delivered and is doing whatever they need to do to support the team to deliver that. If that means addressing the way that what you're describing as precarious work is dealt with, then that needs to be what they address, as opposed to just being a victim of the fact that, we've got lots of different flexible contracts. It's, that needs managing. It's not delivering the service.
It's very interesting, because when you asked that question, my heart sank and I wasn't able to think of anything to say about it. And hearing you talk, Antonia, I was I thought how difficult, how much we're asking of managers to be able to hold that. So yes, you can come up with, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, and very practical steps towards managing it. But actually, I'm going to the undertow of how impossibly difficult that is, and what one does with that sense of, I'm going to call it despair, and how to hold on to a sense of what might be possible. And I think what might be possible is much smaller than one would want.
Yeah.
I need to hold on to that, because it's to acknowledge how difficult it is, and yet hope that people will find a way of finding hope and a remembrance of their professional integrity is the job. At a much more social dynamic way of thinking about it. So I get worried about, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and I hear you being absolutely clear, and I agree. But it isn't just chick-chack, we'll do this, we'll do that. No. It's a much more precarious way of managing, and I think it asks a huge amount of people in those settings.
Yeah. But isn't there then a leadership issue here? So where leadership is about saying it is a very complex problem.
Yes.
We're going to pick a couple of things that might make a material difference, and we're going to focus on trying to get some progress through a couple of things.
It's so interesting, because you're right, and I despair of it being possible. So I'm holding something about yes, but that I hear around a lot, and I don't know it's whether people have become discouraged. You mentioned a figure at some point about being able to take authority and pride in one's personal work, or whether people are damaged is the wrong word, worn down by the demands of the work in a very ungenerous setting.
I think I'm going to give you two statistics which I think are very helpful in thinking about this, because something is going wrong with leadership and management in health and social care because of this reason. So according to, I think it's the HMJ, 20% of senior leadership positions in health and social care are vacant at this point. People don't want the jobs. That goes up to 37% in mental health. To me, that's speaking to this sense of despair. I think it's also speaking to the impossibility of reconciling the clinical demands and the financial or leadership demands. I had another statistic which was very important.
47%.
That was 37%.
No, you talked about 47% targets or something.
47%, you're right. You see, I forget this figure because it's kind of been obliterated from our collective memory. But 2 years ago, again, this was the BMJ, did a survey of senior leaders across the NHS. 47% of senior leaders said they were going to leave their jobs because of bullying from a political, from a ministerial level, and from their own trusts and boards. They didn't do that, by the way, but 47% felt they were being bullied at senior level, which again says a great deal about how we treat our leaders, that it has, for many, it's become an impossible job.
Or how we think about health and social care, to talk about it in terms of a not subsidised service. If it is social care and it's the well-being of our whole community, and we have, I'm not talking politically, I'm talking emotionally, then you don't look at whether you're making a profit or a loss on it. You provide it. It's a subsidised service for the. Now, if all of that was said, then I think that 47% wouldn't feel bullied, and I don't think you'd have a gap in. But you can't change a whole world way of thinking about the origins of the NHS, which is how it was. But that's a huge shift in perception, and I think it's been eroded so gradually since the end of the war, the end of the Second World War in the UK. I'm going to, contain that the thought of it turning round and being completely subsidised, whatever it cost, would be a huge change in the perception of the work that we were doing. I've only just thought of that.
I'm thinking about this financial management versus clinical management issue, and I'm thinking there's some evidence that there's innovation taking place within social and mental health care.
Yeah.
And the innovation is delivering real results.
Yes.
Better service, equal or less cost.
Yes.
More effective.
Yes.
What is difficult to understand is the transfer of those ideas across borders and boundaries. So you talked yesterday about therapeutic communities. There is real evidence that therapeutic communities deliver better results.
Yeah.
But it requires a particular way of working, particular setting, but it delivers.
All right,
Okay.
hospices is another one.
Right, okay.
Hospices is a prime example of quality of care,
Right.
not funded.
So what is it about? Is it just that actually we've got to accept that for these good ideas to get it, be put in place and to have traction across such a massive system is a 30-year job? Do we just have to accept that? Or is there something else about the way that the system works, the big system works, that means that actually we could be doing some things that meant that good ideas got transferred more quickly?
I think you're right, that good ideas could be transferred, and there was a whole development going on in the NHS about that. Find examples of excellence and transfer them.
Yeah.
Now I've got to talk about the dynamic setting of that. You have to have the right people in the right place with enough resilience, and we're getting on to what is good leadership, with the energy and the creativity and the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
So my guess is those centres of excellence, which were doing all those things, had exactly the right configuration of people and environment and intent to make it work. Now, whether you can do that in place B needs a lot more work to support it.
So I'm going to ask you a sort of summary question. I think that's right. Which is, can you define what you think the leadership qualities are that are needed in health and social care?
I said it earlier. Shall I carry on with someone? And I've been mentioning it all the way through. I think there are people that you've met and I've met, that we've all met, who manage to hold on to a sense of themselves and what they want to do, and have enough emotional and intellectual capacity to hold on to both the despair and the hope. And I think that asks a huge amount of some of the managers and the leaders that I've met, to be this perfect person, that's the wrong word, to be this person that can hold on to all of that in the face of what they've got to do is a big ask. But they're there, but my worry is about the erosion. So celebrate them, reward them, do something about allowing them to be as good as they are. That would be...
Yeah. So I'm sort of thinking, almost some of my things sound a bit glib compared to that, but I think good management, whether it's coming from a clinical, a professionally qualified person, or whether it comes from a professional manager, good management is about getting out there and listening to people. And it's going out there with a frame that says, I've got a clear sense of what we're trying to do here.
Yes.
What are you thinking about the way that you're working and your job and what you're coping with? and the way that fits with what we're trying to do here. So it's about listening.
And knowing that they've got the authority and responsibility to implement something.
Yeah.
Because it's no good being able to listen and have the emotional energy to do it if you're in a setting that isn't going to allow you to do that.
If you're in a setting, or if you're in a, if you're in a setting, or if you personally don't feel able to do something about it, and then you get into a question of the continuing need to do work in the area of management selection, management development, and again, I'm not talking about just professional management. I'm talking about clinical leadership and management as well. Yeah. Are the right people in the jobs? Are they being developed? Are they being held accountable in a positive way? Are they being recognised?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you one final question each, which is just to answer, what is it that keeps you working in this field?
Well, it's really easy, because if you get into the knitting of, into the bowels of, places of work, there are always, and I've never come across a situation where this is not the case, there are always good people trying to do a good job. And my job is about finding ways of pouring water and fertiliser on those people. I've never had a situation where there isn't great people trying to break out and to, make a success of things.
We call that in my field the flight for health.
The flight for health.
And so I'll add to that. I think my moments of joy is when somebody or a group of people find a way of accessing some power, and they go, they understand something, and they move into it. Oh, yes.